Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving back into some entitled people stories. Today we've got 3 tales of people who thought paperwork, condescension, or sheer stubbornness would get them their way. One involves a parent who tried to use FOI law over a bus stop, another a self-appointed expert who met 9 a.m. brain, and the last a city transplant who sued geese. Stick around until the end, we'll break them down, and you can vote in the comments for the best story. You'll be calling your lawyer? Just what I wanted to hear. Back when I worked as a privacy and freedom of information officer for a large school board, I learned very quickly that the public's right to know can mean a lot of different things. Most requests were straightforward. People wanted to know senior staff salaries, how much a vendor contract was worth, or copies of routine board emails. Annoying sometimes, but manageable. And then there were the other ones, the ones that came from someone with a grudge and a lot of free time. This particular saga started with a bus stop. A parent, I'll call her Denise, had asked the transportation department to move her children's bus stop from the entrance of her cul-de-sac to directly in front of her house. We're talking about a difference of roughly 100 meters, about a minute and a half of walking at a child's pace. The request was denied. The reason was simple. The turning circle at the end of her cul-de-sac was too tight for the bus to safely maneuver. Risk management, liability, basic geometry. That should have been the end of it. It was not. Instead, Denise filed a Freedom of Information request that looked like a grocery list written by someone who'd just discovered bureaucracy as a weapon. She wanted thousands of emails from multiple departments. She wanted committee meeting minutes, draft reports, internal memos, handwritten notes from staff meetings, and any communications that referenced her, her address, her children, or bus routing decisions in general. 12 different employees were named in her request. 12. And I was a one-person office. When a request like that comes in, it doesn't mean I can just hit print. Every record has to be searched, reviewed, and scrubbed of personal information that isn't relevant. Student names, phone numbers, internal identifiers, unrelated discussions, all of that must be redacted. IT has to pull archived emails, departments have to comb through shared drives. It's slow, tedious work. After about a month of steady digging, Denise called me. "What is taking so long?" she demanded the second I picked up. "This is ridiculous." I explained calmly that I was the only person handling FOI requests for the entire board and that her file was extensive. I even outlined the process for her: searches, review, redactions, consultations. She cut me off. "This is intentional. You're part of it. You're all trying to hide something." I've heard that tone before. It's the voice of someone who's already written the ending in their head. "There is no conspiracy," I said. "It's simply a matter of volume. If you don't produce all the records immediately, I will contact my lawyer." There it was. In my experience, anyone who casually announces they're calling their lawyer rarely has one on retainer for freedom of information matters, especially not over a bus stop that's 100 meters away from their preferred location. But I kept my voice neutral. "Oh, we certainly don't want it to come to that," I said. "I'll finalize the calculations today." And I did. The legislation governing our process is very clear. We are required to charge fees for search time and preparation time. The rate was $7.50 per 15 minutes for searching, and the same for preparation, reviewing, and redacting. That doesn't include copying, printing, or technical support. Because her request involved archived emails and system backups, our ICT department had to assist. Their time counts too. By the time I ran the numbers, the total sat at $4,870. The law also requires a 50% deposit before we proceed with large requests. I called her the next day. "Hello?" she answered, clipped and impatient. "Hi, Denise," I said. "The first batch of records will be ready by the end of the week. I just need to confirm how you'd like to handle the processing fees." "Processing fees?" she repeated. "What fees?" "The total estimated cost for search and preparation is $4,870. As required under the legislation, we'll need a 50% deposit, $2,435 before continuing." There was a long silence. Not the dramatic kind, the stunned kind. "That can't be right," she said finally. "It's calculated strictly according to the statute," I replied. "Your request covers thousands of records across multiple departments. We've documented all time spent. You expect me to pay almost $5,000? I expect you to pay the legally mandated fee if you wish to proceed. Another silence. I haven't even spoken to my lawyer yet, she snapped. I'm sure your lawyer will be able to explain the fee structure, I said pleasantly. You haven't heard the end of this, she shouted. I'm calling the local news. And then she hung up. I documented the call, filed the cost estimate, and waited for the deposit. It never came. No check, no wire transfer, no lawyer's letter, no news crew at the front door. 3 years have passed. Her file is still technically open, sitting in the archive under pending, deposit required. Every so often, when I was still in that role, I'd scroll past it and chuckle quietly to myself. She came armed with the language of suspicion and conspiracy. You responded with the language of fees and forms. Her weapon was the request, your shield was the price tag. She thought she was wielding the law. She didn't realize the law also has a cost of doing business clause. The $4,870 isn't a punishment. It's just the honest, itemized cost of her own anger. The bus stop never moved. The turning circle still too small. What Denise seemed not to understand was that freedom of information laws exist to provide access, not to serve as a punishment tool for minor inconveniences. When you ask for everything under the sun, you pay for the sun. And in the end, it turns out that 100 meters of walking wasn't worth $4,870 after all. And our second story. The day I accidentally emotionally destroyed a condescending engineering tech with a one-word answer. For context, I work in quality at a factory that builds precision parts. I'm in my 30s, and while I work closely with engineers, I am not one. I also very intentionally work second shift because I'm not built for mornings. It takes me 2 cups of coffee and a solid hour of silence before I'm even close to functional. If you catch me before that, you're rolling the dice. This particular week, however, I was temporarily on first shift for training. I was working toward a certification that only one other person in the entire building had. That person was Jeremy, a soft-spoken guy in his 70s who should have retired 5 years ago, but refuses to because, in his words, I get bored fishing every day. Jeremy is calm, thoughtful, and doesn't waste words. At 9 a.m., he and I coexist beautifully because neither of us feels the need to fill the air with noise. Unfortunately, there's also Barry. Barry's in his 40s and works as an engineering tech. Not an engineer, no degree, but you'd never know that from the way he talks. He's loud, he's condescending, he's deeply in love with the sound of his own voice. He corners people in hallways to explain how brilliant he is. He inserts himself into conversations that don't involve him. He delivers lectures no one asked for. Multiple coworkers have independently told me that if Barry were half as smart as he believes he is, he'd be twice as smart as anyone in the building. He is, in short, a nightmare for 9 a.m. brain. On Tuesday, about 6 hours into my extended shift, I had a simple question. I was reviewing a blueprint and needed clarification on which dimension I was supposed to measure. The instructions were unclear. I turned to a coworker, specifically not Barry, and asked, "Hey, which of these 2 dimensions are we verifying?" Barry heard the word dimension from across the room and appeared like someone had rung a summoning bell. "Well," he began, dragging a chair over without invitation, "this is actually a great opportunity to revisit the Pythagorean theorem." I froze internally. For the next 45 minutes, I received a full high school geometry refresher, hypotenuses, angles, squares of sums. He paced while he talked. He drew triangles. He kept sprinkling in little comments like, "Now you don't have to remember this, but I do, and don't worry, you'll never need to actually understand this." I needed one number, just one. Jeremy caught my eye at one point and subtly slid a coffee toward me like I was in the middle of a hostage situation. Wednesday was more of the same. A few hours into the morning, I walked across the room to use a piece of equipment for a measurement. Barry swooped in. "Look at you trying to learn new things," he said. "Need help with that?" "Nope," I replied evenly. "I've got it." That apparently translated to, "Please explain calibration theory for the next 30 minutes." By Thursday, I was running on fumes. I had my coffee in hand and zero tolerance for nonsense. I walked into the room and aimed straight for Jeremy's workstation. In my half-awake state, I didn't notice Barry standing slightly off to the side until I walked directly into him. I mumbled, "Sorry," without looking up. Barry stepped back dramatically. "Oh, that's okay. What are you doing here?" I blinked at him. My brain was buffering. "I work here," I said slowly, like I was explaining gravity to a toddler. Jeremy made a choking noise behind me. Someone else stifled a laugh. Barry squinted. "Well, yes, but what are you doing here?" "Working," I said, complete deadpan. Jeremy was now fully turned away, shoulders shaking. Barry pressed on. "Well, what are you working on?" I took a long sip of coffee. "Work?" 3 words, that's all it took. You didn't engage his condescension, didn't explain yourself, didn't feed his ego with a real answer. You just gave him the verbal equivalent of a brick wall. He had no script for someone who refused to play his game. At that point, someone outright snorted. Another guy coughed in a way that was very clearly not a cough. Barry looked around, realized he was the only one not in on whatever just happened, and for the first time since I'd known him, didn't have anything to say. He just stood there for a second, processing. I didn't break eye contact. Eventually, he gave a little shrug like he'd decided I wasn't worth the effort and walked away. Jeremy leaned over and muttered, "That might be the most efficient thing I've ever seen." The rest of the room dissolved into actual laughter once Barry was out of earshot. It was a tiny exchange, no shouting, no grand speech, no calling him out, just pure weaponized monotone. But the effect was immediate. For the next couple of months, Barry barely acknowledged my existence. If I asked a question, he pretended he hadn't heard it. If I walked into a room, he found a different corner to occupy. He stopped hovering when I used equipment. He stopped offering to help. He even stopped cornering me in the hallway to explain something I didn't ask about. Apparently, being treated like an overeager child explaining colors to an adult wounded him more deeply than any direct confrontation could have. He spent years positioning himself as the expert, the explainer, the smartest guy in every room, and you just didn't acknowledge that role. You gave him the same energy you'd give a piece of furniture. A man who lives for attention can't survive being treated like background noise. The funniest part? I didn't even plan it. That was just my brain operating at 15% capacity before 9 a.m. I still work second shift. Jeremy eventually passed his knowledge on and renewed his certification for another year because he wasn't ready to leave yet. Barry still talks too much, but not to me. Now when we pass in the hallway, he nods politely and keeps walking. And every so often I hear someone in the background answer a vague question with a flat "work." It never stops being funny. And our last story. Karen moved next to a 150-year-old farm and complained that the animals were too loud. I lived beside the beach my entire life in a small rural village where farming isn't just something people do, it's the backbone of the community. The kind of place where tractors are more common than taxis, and people wave when they pass you on the road, and where nobody thinks twice about the sound of animals in the morning. Our family property has been here for generations. The houses on the land date back to the 1850s, and the fields were farmed long before that. When my parents bought the place over 40 years ago, it was already a working farm. Since then, we've raised cattle, sheep, donkeys, ponies, and all kinds of poultry. I grew up with it, feeding birds before school, fixing fences on weekends, learning early that animals don't operate on a quiet 9-to-5 schedule. Some of the geese waddling around my yard today actually belong to my grandfather. They're over 20 years old, stubborn, loud, and surprisingly intelligent. They've survived storms, predators, and decades of changing farmland around them. Noise has never been an issue here. It's the countryside. When you open your window in the morning, you hear birds, wind, maybe a tractor starting somewhere in the distance. That's part of the deal. Which is why everyone in the village found it mildly amusing and then quickly irritating when a woman from the big city bought a renovated cottage down the road. We'll call her Karen. Karen arrived with all the usual signs: spotless SUV, designer wellies that had clearly never seen mud, and the unmistakable energy of someone who thought she had just purchased a peaceful country retreat straight out of a magazine. Except the countryside isn't curated, it's alive. From the start, she made it clear she didn't like the animals. She'd wrinkle her nose when passing fields. Once I overheard her complaining to someone that the smell of silage was unacceptable. Another time, she asked a neighbor if the cows were temporary. Temporary cows. Yet somehow, despite disliking everything that makes rural life rural, she chose to buy a property in the middle of a farming community. Still, no one expected what came next. One morning, I opened my post and found an official letter from the council. It stated that someone had made a formal complaint about animal and bird noise coming from my property. According to the letter, the birds were squawking at all hours and could allegedly be heard as far away as the beach. I live beside the beach. For a moment, I genuinely thought it had been sent to the wrong address. The letter went on to advise me to consider removing the birds to another location and politely warned that if the noise continued, the matter could be pursued through the district court. Court over geese. I won't lie, it caught me off guard, not because I believed I'd done anything wrong, but because dealing with legal threats is stressful no matter how ridiculous they are. Wanting to be reasonable, I decided to act in good faith. I reduced the number of birds, particularly the adult males, since they tend to be louder during breeding season. Some I gave away for free, others had to be culled, which wasn't just emotionally frustrating, but financially stupid. Several were purebred lines that would have fetched strong prices later in the year. But I wanted the situation resolved quickly. You gave up good birds, lost money, tried to make peace. She never even knocked on your door. She went straight to the council. That's not a neighbor, that's an attack. What bothered me most, though, was one line in the council's guidance notes. It said the complainant should first attempt to speak directly with the person responsible before filing a report. No one had approached me. Not once. In 40 years on this property, nobody had ever complained about the animals, and now suddenly it was a legal matter? The more I thought about it, the more it annoyed me. So instead of quietly absorbing the blame, I picked up the phone and called the council officer listed on the letter. I calmly explained that this wasn't some new hobby farm. It was long-established agricultural land in a farming zone. I asked whether anyone from the council had actually visited before sending warnings about court action. There was a pause, then some backtracking. No, they hadn't inspected the property, so I invited them to come out. A week later, 2 officials arrived. I walked them around the yard, showed them the old stone buildings that had housed livestock for decades, explained breeding season noise, and pointed out the obvious: this village has always been agricultural. Right on cue, a tractor rumbled past on the road, a dog barked somewhere across a field, seagulls shrieked overhead. I gestured around. Are those mine too? I asked. They tried very hard not to smile. But I hadn't just prepared a tour, I'd done my homework. I presented historical maps showing agricultural use going back generations, zoning documents confirming the land's designation, and printed excerpts from Right to Farm Protection stating that normal farm activity, including animal noise, is not considered a nuisance. The tone of the visit shifted quickly. Then one of the officers let something slip. The complaint had come from a relatively new resident, someone who'd already made multiple noise complaints in the area. Karen. Suddenly, everything made sense. She hadn't moved into the countryside for what it was, she moved for what she imagined it should be. A few days later, another letter arrived, very different tone this time. After inspection, the council concluded there was no breach of regulation, the number of birds was appropriate for the land, and typical agricultural noise did not qualify as a statutory nuisance. Case closed. But here's the part no one saw coming. During their review, the council discovered that Karen's property had undergone renovations without full approval, including an extension built closer to a boundary than regulations allowed. I didn't report it. Didn't need to. Small villages run on information the way cities run on traffic. Within a week, neighbors were chuckling about it. One older farmer clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Imagine moving next to farms and being shocked there are animals." Since then, silence. No more letters, no more complaints. I've slowly rebuilt my flock, responsibly, sensibly, because this is what the land has always been used for. The geese still honk when something disturbs them, the birds still greet the sunrise louder than any alarm clock, and the countryside remains exactly what it's always been. Karen learned something important through all this. You can't move into a farming community that predates your house by over a century and then demand it behave like a gated suburb. Out here, life is loud. And thankfully, the law agrees. Let's talk about who paid the real price. Story 1's weapon was math. Denise demanded thousands of records. The OP calculated the legal fees and handed her the bill. No argument, no defense, just $4,870 of, "Are you sure?" She wasn't. Her lawyer never called. Story 2's weapon was inertia. Barry needed an audience. The OP gave him a wall. No explanation, no engagement, just work. A man who lives for attention can't survive being treated like background noise. He's still quiet around her. But Story 3 wins, not because the revenge was dramatic, it wasn't. The council ruled, Karen lost, case closed. But then the epilogue hit. Her own renovation was unapproved. She came for the geese and left with a boundary dispute. So what's your verdict? Which story had the best response? Vote in the comments, 1, 2, or 3. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.